Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. What happens when jobs disappear, when a factory closes or an industry fades away? In every case, something is left behind, the workers, as well as their families, their hopes, their aspirations. Is it possible for such workers to retool and retrain, or will they be stuck in a state of un- or underemployed limbo? That's what we're here to talk about today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. The topic today, job training and jobs, and whether one always leads to the other. There's been a major shift in the country of manufacturing jobs have dwindled, upsetting the career security for workers who don't have the education to compete in higher tech fields. Are replacement jobs available? If so, where are they? I'm joined by two experts who analyze the labor market and a journalist who wrote a book documenting what happened to the workers in Janesville, Wisconsin when their auto plant closed. Suddenly, these midlife workers found themselves in college classes, sometimes for the first time ever. Could they salvage a career and maintain their incomes? We'll also take questions from viewers. Tweet them at NatPress or submit via Facebook. Welcome to all three of you. So we have with us, I'm joined by Tony Carnevale of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, Amy Goldstein of the Washington Post and author of Janesville, An American Story. We will be talking about the book in a bit. And Aaron Smith of the Pew Research Center. So as I said, we're here to talk about job training, job security, the shift in manufacturing jobs. And I just want to remind our viewers we'll be taking questions from you. If you have a question, please tweet it at NatPress, and we'll work those into the conversation as best we can. So Amy, we're going to be taking a macro look at the labor market and what's happened over the last few decades. But you've just taken a very micro look at one town and one factory, showing how these big trends we'll be talking about are played out in one community, in one factory. So tell me a bit about Janesville.
Well, as you said, I wanted to take a close-up look at what really happens when good working-class jobs go away. And Janesville turned out to be a very good setting to write about this. I particularly wanted to focus on what happened to a community that had never been part of the Rust Belt before, but really took an economic blow as a result of the Great Depression almost a decade ago. And Janesville had been a very economically healthy place for a long time. It had something called the Janesville Assembly Plant, which had been the oldest operating General Motors plant in the country until it shut down 2 days before Christmas of 2008. Mm-hmm. This was a plant that had started out making tractors just after World War I, and it started turning out Chevys in 1923. So if you think about all those decades, there were generations of people in town for whom these General Motors jobs and jobs at supplier companies that grew up around the assembly plant were the best working class jobs you could imagine. General Motors was paying $28 an hour at the end. And to have all this work vanish, the county for which Janesville is the county seat lost 9,000 jobs in 2008 and 2009. So I was really interested in taking a look at what happens next when you have this sudden loss of good work.
Now, what I like about the book is that it's both journalism, it's a narrative nonfiction book, but it's also social science. And you actually did a couple of surveys, in which you were reaching out to the people of Janesville, the people who had gone through job training efforts there, who had been laid off, to find how they were coping emotionally and financially and job-wise in the aftermath. So, in big picture, we'll get into some of the details later, but in general, for those who had taken a new job, how were they faring?
Well, as you mentioned, I did a survey with some people at the University of Wisconsin at Madison looking just at Rock County. We did this in 2013. So it was about 5 years after all these automotive jobs had vanished and about 4 years after the official end of the Great Recession. And what we really wanted to understand were what were people's economic attitudes, what was their outlook about how the economy was doing broadly, and what were their lives like, and what had their lives been like in these intervening 4 or 5 years. And what we found, to answer your question, was that for people who had changed jobs, whether or not they had changed jobs as a result of a layoff or not, the odds that they were making more money after changing a job was very low. Only about 1/4 of the people said that they were making more money than at their previous job, and more than half said that they were making less money.
Okay. So, and Tony, you kind of study that same issue on a national level. So, during the time that Janesville was going through its job losses, what was happening nationally, particularly among manufacturing workers?
Well, we began to see a huge structural shift in the economy after the 1980-81 recession.
Mm-hmm.
So beginning in 1983, we began to see high levels of automation, largely connected to computer-based technology, in which the computer and its ability to run other machines, in the end, substituted for any repetitive task in a job and eventually for whole jobs. So what we saw in manufacturing, and in those days I worked with Chrysler and Ford, and what we saw was we went from a 5-person, usually 5-man, but not always, working team on the factory floor to 3 and then to 2, and the technology substituted for those 5 people. So we began to see technology improve productivity in manufacturing dramatically. That is, we all got rich as they lost their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, when their jobs went overseas, and not all of them did, only about 30% of manufacturing jobs went overseas eventually. When their jobs went overseas, they sent us back quality product ultimately that we all
Right.
bought in large package stores and so on. So while all of us have benefited enormously from this change, some of us have been hurt mightily.
Okay. So, so tell me a little bit more about the work that you. Tell me a little bit about the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, and what's the focus of what you do there?
The focus is that we're economists who try as we might couldn't escape getting involved with education, because if you're a labor economist, as I am
Right.
in America, beginning in the 80s, the issue increasingly shifted to skills. So what we saw in 83, at the same time this automation process began heating up, we saw at the same time that for the remaining jobs, skill requirements increased for lots of reasons, including the technology, which had a flexible capability that required more skill to exploit.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went from a high school economy in the 70s. 2 out of 3 workers in America had high school, or they were high school dropouts, and they were doing fine. After 1983, American employers needed more skill to get quality, variety, customization, and the huge increase in productivity in areas like manufacturing put a lot of money in a lot of people's pockets, which they spent on services. So financial services, healthcare, business services, computing itself, which is a service function, began to take on more and more of the jobs, and those were more highly skilled. So between 83 and the middle 90s, we saw the wage premium, that is the value of a college degree over a high school degree, jump from about 30% to 84%. And the value of graduate degrees, especially for males, went up to, over a high school degree, went up to 94%. So, and the other thing that happened in 1983 is that we began to see in the United States a growing difference in earnings among us.
Right.
All owed to the same thing, or mostly. About 70 to 80% of the increase in inequality since 83, which has been historic, is due to whether or not people get post-secondary education and training with value, economic value, not necessarily educational value. So it's a new world. I mean, it's a huge structural shift from who we were in the 1970s.
Now, one of the things you write about, one of your prime reports, is good jobs that pay without a BA. So give us a little sense, what's your definition of a good job? And I mean, do they still exist? How many of them are out there?
There are 30 million of them, and our definition is, our definition, defining a good job is something in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
But in statistical terms, we determined a good job was a job you could make about 35 grand a year at until you were in your mid 30s to late 30s. Thereafter, we decided you had to make 45 grand a year. Overall, when you track people over all those years, you're talking about a job that at, let's say, middle age 45, pays roughly 55 grand a year.
Mm-hmm.
So we built a somewhat arbitrary definition of a good job and discovered there are 30 million of them. There are actually 3 million more of these good jobs that pay that don't require a BA, a Bachelor of Arts degree, or a Bachelor of Science degree either. The distinctive feature of them is that the manufacturing share declined by about 2/3,
Mm-hmm.
and almost all of the new good jobs came in service functions.
Okay. And so you went with good jobs that pay without a BA because it rhymes. As opposed to good jobs that pay without a BS.
I'm from the Muhammad Ali School of Economics.
Okay, got it. So Aaron, at the Pew Research Center, you study people's attitudes toward their jobs and what they need to stay employed. So one of your primary reports is the state of American jobs. So tell us a little bit about, big picture, what did you find in that report, and are people satisfied with the work that they have?
Sure. So one of the things that we did a survey as part of that report, as well as an economic analysis of some government data. And a lot of the trends that we saw in the government data are things that Tony just mentioned. So if you look at the changing nature of jobs since 1980, we saw two key trends there. The first is that there's been much more growth in jobs requiring higher levels of training and preparation and experience relative to jobs requiring lower levels of training. And there's been much higher growth in jobs requiring high-level social and analytic skills relative to jobs requiring physical and manual skills. And so if you kind of put those trends together, certain groups of the population have had a better chance navigating some of those trends. So interestingly enough, women have actually benefited more from those than men have.
Mm-hmm.
People who have a college education have benefited more from those than people who have not attended college. And just in general, people who can develop those higher level social and analytic skills have just done better for themselves than people who haven't been able to do that. And so that's kind of what's happening at the macro level. And when you take that back to the individual level in the survey, we found that people are pretty split on whether they're satisfied with their current job. About 50% say they are and 50% say they aren't. But if you look at some of those breaks that I just mentioned, college graduates, for instance, or just generally people with higher levels of education, are generally much more satisfied with their current job than people with lower levels of education. And that actually plays out in lots of other aspects of their lives. Those people are also happier with their overall careers, they feel more positive about their family life, and generally see things moving in a better direction in the future for themselves.
Is the level of satisfaction, is it more tied to income? I mean, or to education?
So it's tied to both, and these things tend to overlap.
Right.
One of the things we've actually asked in a separate study what people are looking for or what they consider to be a good job. And one of the things that was a little bit interesting is that having a high-paying job generally ranks much lower than you might expect on the list of things people are looking for. Obviously, you need a certain level of income to be secure, but in general, the things that people really value are things like having a job that they enjoy. Having a stable job is very important to people, so knowing that they have a paycheck coming and that they have some long-term prospects, being able to take off time to deal with family and attend to things that come up in their lives, and having good benefits. So certainly income is important to people, and to the extent that income and education are correlated, we certainly see higher income workers expressing greater levels of job satisfaction. But income, I think, plays less of a role than you might think when people describe what makes a good job.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about getting those good jobs and the job training aspect of this. So Tony, somebody had a good job, maybe at an auto plant like in Janesville or one of the other manufacturing plants out there. When they lose that job, I mean, what's the best strategy for them? I mean, do they need to go, should they go get a BA, or are there enough of the good jobs that pay without a BA that they can continue their career that way? What's the best job training strategy for them?
Two of the trends that occurred in the economics of work and education or training after '83. The first one is the one the educators love, especially people where I work at Georgetown. And that is that the value of a college degree, a BA, relative to a high school degree, doubled.
Right.
So everybody should get a BA. Not really, because the second thing that happened that is more complicated and I suspect more consequential in the long term is that the variation in earnings by level of education grew much more. So we doubled the overall wage premium for a bachelor's degree. We quintupled the differences in earnings at every degree level, which is to say, but I can give you concrete examples. So 45% of people who get BAs make more than the average person makes with a graduate degree now. 30% of people with two-year degrees make more than the average person with a BA, and actually more than about 20% of people with graduate degrees. And then there are even one-year certificates that make more than an AA or a BA. The difference being a lot of this depends on field of study. So in any particular field of study, if you get a certificate in engineering, you'll do better than people with other certificates. If you get a two-year degree in engineering, you'll do better than people with other two-year degrees except computers, but you'll certainly do better than somebody with a certificate. You get a BA, you make more.
Right.
Actually, with engineering, it stops. A PhD makes less than a BA in engineering. But in most, so there are new rules of the game here.
Right. So somebody who's getting a certificate program or an associate's degree in a computer or tech field, a good number of them will end up with better earnings than somebody who's gotten a BA in one of the social sciences or something like that.
Yeah, well, in the social sciences, in education, in psychology,
Or journalism,
in the
probably.
humanities, journalism, like English as a major, actually among the humanities is one of the higher earning majors.
Okay.
So as is American history for reasons I can't explain.
Right.
But it all, what you take will determine what you make. It's no longer so much about the institution you go to, which is the way people think about college and post-secondary education.
Right.
It's what you take when you get there, more than the institution that determines your earnings now.
All right. So, Aaron, you in one of your reports, you have a question dealing with asking workers or respondents whether they are mismatched in their jobs, their level of education compared with what they actually need for their particular job. What's the findings there?
So I believe the finding you're mentioning there is that 40% of workers say that they have more formal qualifications than their job requires, and I have an even better one that I actually prefer myself.
Sure.
We asked people if someone with less formal education could learn to do the job that they do, and 3/4 of workers said that was the case.
Right.
And I think what that speaks to is some interesting attitudes in terms of how people perceive the way that they develop the skills that they need for their job. So we asked a set of questions about how people gain the skills that they need to do their jobs well. And we got a mix of answers. There was no clear number one response. But in many cases, what people told us is that they learn those skills either on the job or just through general life experience, rather than through their formal educational experience. There are some exceptions to that, so people who are in highly technical fields like computer science and engineering were much more likely to point to their educational background. People who said that they rely heavily on writing and communication skills said the same thing. And as we can get into later, people's attitudes towards college are fairly nuanced on this front, but in general, people place a really high emphasis on the job learning and general life experience as a way to develop and improve their overall job skills.
Okay.
I mean, it is still true, as it was in the 70s, much more true in the 70s than it is now, that the best trainer is a job. If you try to quantify, and economists do, if you try to quantify learning on the job, we know that employers do about 140, there's disagreement about this number, but let's say 140 to 160 billion dollars worth of formal job training every year. There's another number which is 300 to 400 billion in informal OJT.
Yeah.
So in the
OJT,
end,
on-the-job
on the
training.
job training,
Right.
informal on the job training, sitting by Jenny and learning how to do the computer program.
Mhm.
So and that is still the case. That is, the way it works is you go to school, you get a set of skills, that gives you access to a particular occupation, and generally a particular industry, which influences your earnings. And then the next major, and then you start learning on the job, and you move from job to job to job to job. And nowadays, the more times you move, the better you do.
Right.
Being loyal to your employer instead of your skill development in this day and age is foolish. So that there is a lifelong learning has always been a reality. It's now that what's different now is there's a lot more front loading in terms of the education and training that opens up access to particular occupations and industry.
Okay. So let's talk a bit about, Amy, I want you to tell me a little bit what's going on the ground in Janesville. So you were closely tracking the workers who had been laid off from the GM plant or from a couple of other related plants in town. I mean, tell us a little about what did they do? Did they go back to school? Did they go get technical degree training somewhere? Other kind of job training?
Well, as you say, I was very interested in the ground level experience of these people who had suddenly lost jobs that they thought would last their entire working lives.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that I quickly learned is that it's a very traumatic experience. So trying to figure out what to do in this kind of, you know, jarring context is not an easy thing. And on top of that, because this General Motors plant had been the heart of this community's economy for so long, there was a lot of denial. People thought for quite a few years after the plant had closed that it was only a matter of time before it was going to come back. And because people who had worked at the plant itself, as opposed to some of these supplier companies, were getting union kind of post-work extra unemployment benefits, the economic shock of it was cushioned for a year or two in many people's cases. But eventually people did have to come to terms with the fact that these jobs, this plant was not reopening, at least no time, you know, quickly. It ultimately never did open. And they had to figure out something. So as I came to think about it, I was trying to understand what choices people were making when there were no good choices left.
Right.
And there was a place in town, kind of place that exists in many communities all around the country, called the Rock County Job Center. That was the place that people turned when they were shell-shocked and didn't know what to do when their jobs had just gone away. And this job center was the recipient of a lot of federal retraining money. Two kinds of
Specifically tied
retraining.
to the Great Recession or in the fall?
Well,
of
for
that?
dislocated workers, there are a
Yeah.
couple of big federal programs that provide tuition, pays for textbooks, pays for mileage in some cases for people to get to school. So the counselors at this job center were encouraging people to go back to school. They didn't say you have to, but they said, you know, there's help. You know, we can't help you put dinner on the table. We can help you pay to go back to school. So there was a fair amount of kind of spirit in the culture that this is what people should do. And Janesville has a technical college called Blackhawk Technical College that had been around for nearly a century when the bottom fell out of the economy. And that's where a lot of people went. And what I was trying to understand was what was the experience of factory workers suddenly becoming students, and what was the experience of this college that was trying very, very hard to help the transition of these people from factory workers into students. And it was hard for everybody. I mean, that's the bottom line of what I found. You know, if you think about a plant where people have a lot of seniority, these were men and women, often in their 30s and 40s, who hadn't been in school for half a lifetime. Janesville has a pretty good public school system, so there were people going to college. So the people who had gone into these local factory jobs might not have been so crazy about being students in the first place, and now they're having to learn to be students in approaching middle age or in middle age.
Right.
That's a hard transition when you're also worrying about how you're going to keep the mortgage going.
I mean, there's a nice passage that I have in front of me here from Janesville, and again, Janesville, An American Story, Amy Goldstein. So, at your favorite book retailer and Amazon. As he enters his first class this morning, psychology, Mike is worried. Does he really know how to study? Can he write a research paper? Will he be able to learn to use Word on a computer? Hovering in the background are larger questions. Now that he and Barb are both in school, will they lose their house? Will it all lead to jobs for them in the end? So this is Mike, I can't remember his last
Vaughn.
Mike Vaughn
Yeah.
and his wife Barb. Tell us a little bit about, talk a little bit more about how big an adjustment it was for these workers that you were talking with, and how did Mike and Barb specifically fare in all of this?
Well, one of the things that Mike mentions in this sort of set of worries that he's carrying into school is using a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike actually wasn't bad at using a computer, but the instructors at Blackhawk Tech were astonished because it had not occurred to them that these factory workers had never had developed very good computer skills.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly the college is turning itself into a training factory for computer use. They created these boot camps for how to use a computer. They were also creating boot camps for how to study.
Mm-hmm.
They were putting together study groups for these factory workers to have kind of support systems among themselves. So the college was, I think being very intelligent and trying to help people make this hard transition. Another thing that this college was doing that's not universally true across the country is it was already working with local businesses, those that survived in the community, to try to think through, along with the folks at the job center, where were jobs likely to exist within a year or two so that they could encourage people to go into those fields where jobs in this bad economy, in this town that just lost the heart of its local economy, might actually be available. And what folks at the college were telling me, and what I was hearing from some of the workers themselves, was that people were really, and this goes to your point about what people value in a job, in this case, people were really focused on what could I possibly study that, if it goes well in the end, will get me back to something approaching General Motors wages.
Right.
So they weren't really thinking, the job center was thinking about, well, these have been factory workers. They might not have loved the assembly line, but they liked the paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
Now was a chance for people to really think through what were they good at, what might they really enjoy. And what both the college and the job center found was that a lot of students were making choices based on their perception of the likely salary at the end, not what they might be good at.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a place where kind of, the theory and the on-the-ground reality don't dovetail all that well all the time. In the case of the Vaughns, they actually turned out fine, but it's an interesting illustration of what fine looks like in this kind of a circumstance. Mike had been, he's from a big union family in town. His father and his grandfather and he had all been part of the United Auto Workers local executive committee. He had been the top union guy at the biggest supplier to General Motors, a seat-making plant called Lear Seating. And when he was going back to school, he was trying to think about what would his union skills maybe translate into in a new kind of work. And he ended up deciding to go into a new program that Blackhawk Tech was creating right then in human resources development, human resources management. And he had to really get his head around the idea of transitioning from his union identity to working on the management side of things, which was hard for him,
Mm-hmm.
but he kind of made peace with it, thinking I can help people from either side of this divide. He actually did well in school. He graduated with an AA degree after 2 years, and he got hired within a matter of weeks at a local Seneca Foods plant. He was working an overnight shift. He was making at the outset about half of what he'd been making at the seat-making plant,
Okay.
and felt like the luckiest guy in the world because he had succeeded at his training. He was able to find a job in town. He was able to find a job in what he had studied. And he knew from other folks he knew in town that that wasn't too common.
Right. The finding a job in town, that's kind of a key issue because many of your people, they couldn't find a job in town, or if they wanted to stay within GM so they can maintain their GM levels of seniority, they were working during the Monday through Friday work week in places such as Fort Wayne, Indiana, and somewhere in Texas, correct?
Arlington,
Texas,
outside Kansas City, and in Michigan.
So you talk with some of those folks. I have a passage here talking about a worker, Matt. So now in less than 24 hours, he will be working at a GM plant he's never seen in a city he's never visited. He couldn't think of anything he wanted to do less or anything he needed to do more. And he maintained that for years, and he still is, right?
He's still doing it. So there's a crop of people who call themselves GM gypsies.
Mm-hmm.
And the most significant thing about them is that they're commuting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, their lives and their identities and their families are back in Janesville.
Right.
Because it's a place that have a lot of extended families, because the same kind of work existed in town for so long. People, father to son to, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, were all at this plant. So there are big families in town. And it's not that I don't know anybody that has moved out of town, but it's not a very common thing.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt Wopat, who you just mentioned, took this job in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which was really, he had gone to training. He was studying to try to become a utility worker, and about 2 or 3 months before his year-long certificate program was going to end, came face to face with the hard fact that these older workers in the utility field who were expected to retire because they were getting to be retirement age had lost so much of their savings in the bad economy that they were staying with work. So openings weren't materializing.
So everybody was funneling into this utility worker training system
that didn't really
Didn't
have
need
as
them
much
all.
space for these new people coming along as everybody had imagined a year or two earlier. So Matt, like many people in town, was kind of face to face with the fact that he had to figure out something to do, or he was worried that, they were starting to slip behind on mortgage payments. He was worried that he and his wife and their 3 daughters were going to lose their house.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided that the best thing to do was something that he never wanted to do, which was become one of these GM gypsies. And he leaves every Monday morning in a carpool with a couple of his gypsy buddies from Janesville, drives nearly 300 miles to Fort Wayne, where he starts second shift in the afternoon, works till late Friday night. They make the drive back late at night, sleeps at home in a couple nights in his own bed, turns around and does it all over again. He's been doing it since 2010. He's got several more years to go until he's eligible for the kind of good pension that his father, who was also a GMer, has been drawing.
So he was able to maintain his GM salary and his retirement pension system
At the expense
at
of
the
his
expense
family
of-
living together.
Right. Okay. So Aaron, talk to us a little bit about what your surveys show about people's attitudes toward retraining and getting additional education. In general, are they willing to do so? And if they are, is there a sense that there are jobs at the end of the training?
Sure. So in terms of people's attitudes towards training as a whole, I think it speaks to a lot of what you were just talking about. When we ask people about their views towards the future, we see a lot of stress and concern about just where the overall workforce and the job situation is going. So people tend to see, regardless of whether they're satisfied with their current job or not, a world in which there's less stability of employment, lower levels of benefits, less loyalty from their employers. And as a result, what we've seen is that people have really internalized this idea that they have to be constantly on the skills treadmill, continuously upgrading their abilities in order to keep pace with where the economy is going. So to give you just a couple of numbers, 54% of today's workers say that improving and upgrading their skills is going to be essential to keeping them competitive in the job market. Another third tell us that it's going to be important, even if it's not totally essential. Only around 1 in 10 tell us it's not important for them to keep upgrading their skills moving forward. And there are certain types of workers that say that more than most, but in general, across a broad range of job categories, we really see that people have kind of internalized this notion that they have to be one step out in front of this in order to even stay where they are, much less move forward on things.
Okay, so the kind of retraining that's available out there. Tony, I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about, is this like what they were doing in Rock County, Wisconsin, and Janesville? Is that kind of job training, retraining, is it generally successful, and is that something that's happening in communities all over the country? And is there an effective government role in all of this?
As somebody who's worked at the policy end on training since the 70s, The truth of it is, the last time these kinds of programs worked were in the New Deal.
The last
in
time
the
they worked was
1930s.
during the New Deal.
Yes. And that was because the jobs themselves were supplied.
Mhm.
You have to remember that training doesn't create jobs except for people who do training.
Okay.
Jobs create the demand for training, and where there are no jobs, training is pointless. And the one thing we've learned, because we started doing this retraining thing in the 70s in a relatively big way, it never grew to much. But one thing we've learned from what's called the second chance system, the retraining system, is it's really the first chance that counts. That in the end, we can do a lot more for younger people, and that is becoming increasingly difficult as well. Used to be that a boy or a young woman reached the average wage for their gender by age 25 after they graduate from high school at 18. It now takes them on average to age 32. So there's a huge human capital and work experience load that's required even for the first job. So
Right.
if you lose your job, that's not awful. If you lose your industry, if you were in auto and you have to shift to some other sort of blue-collar labor, that's going to hurt you more. That's another 20% off the top. If you lose your occupation, it's curtains. That is, you're starting all over again. You have very little value added. Your work experience and the learning you've done has very little value added in markets. So, I mean, one of the good news pieces in this is an economy like the one we have now, because jobs create the demand for training, a lot of these training programs should start working. Now, we've never held full employment in the United States long enough
Right.
for them to work for more than a few years. So the real issue here is, what do you do with the losers in this game? Do you guarantee them health care? Do you guarantee their mortgages? Do you guarantee them long-term unemployment insurance? The Europeans spend 4% of GDP on this issue. The United States spends less than 1/2 of 1% on adaptability for these workers.
Now, you all have, at Pew, you've surveyed people about whether they think their government should be doing more. What did you find?
So we found that, at least here in the States, we have a pretty individualistic notion of who should be responsible for making sure workers have the right skills. So we asked that question and gave people a number of responses that they could select from. 7 in 10 Americans say that workers themselves should take the most responsibility for making sure that their skills and abilities are up to date with what's needed in the job market. Fewer than half said the same about the federal or state government. As you might imagine, there was a pretty strong partisan slant there.
Right.
Republicans tended to be much more individually minded. Among Democrats, we saw a lot more support for government programs and the broader education industry. But at a broad level, at least, in many cases, people tell us that they expect workers to be taking responsibility for themselves in terms of developing the skills that they need and making sure that they're appealing in the job market.
Okay, and you asked the same type of question in your survey. What did the residents or the respondents in Janesville have to say?
Well, we asked something related to your point, Tony, about what kind of props should be provided and by whom for people who are sliding downhill, at least sliding downhill in the meantime, trying to figure out whether they can get back up again. And it was really striking that even among those people, and it was about a third of the people in the county who answered our survey who said that they or someone in their home had lost a job in the previous 5 years. So it was very pervasive job loss. Even among those people, slightly fewer than half said that the government should be doing more.
Right.
And among people who hadn't lost jobs, it was only about a quarter. And I found that striking until I started thinking about what did I know from the people I had gotten to know in town about their own receptivity to taking help. And what I was finding when I kind of stepped back, thought about the cumulative experience of all these people I've been, interviewing for a period of years, is that I think what it comes down to is that falling out of the middle class is very different than having been poor all along. And one of the ways in which it's different is that it's very, very hard, even when you're hurting pretty badly economically, to reach out to ask outside your own family and maybe your friendship network for help. So, Wisconsin has, food stamps, it has welfare, it has, Medicaid, it has kinds of assistance that we provide as a country to people who are really in bad shape economically. And, I knew some people who were eventually asking for that kind of help, but it killed them to ask.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and you have some kind of heartbreaking scenes of the Parker Closet in one of the high schools there. The teachers or other people in the school community had collected I guess, food and
Used
groceries
jeans and prom
jeans
dresses
and
for
things
girls
like
so
that.
they go to proms in the springtime.
And it took a lot of convincing for some of the students to actually start to use that, right?
So it took convincing. This is at a high school, one of two high schools in Janesville called Parker High School. It's called Parker High School because in addition to this big old General Motors plant that closed, Janesville also was the home of the Parker Pen Company.
Mm-hmm.
So the high school, one of the high schools is named for Parker, and one's named for the man who brought General Motors to town. So these founding industrialists are wired into the identity of the school system and the community. But at Parker High School, the social studies teacher, who's one of the people whose stories I tell in this book, began noticing that some of her students who had been from middle-class families just were looking like they weren't doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
And so she just on her own began collecting donations with eventually help from some other teachers and other people in the community and inviting students who she thought could use this help to meet the closet.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the high school girls from one of the families that I follow in this story was taken to the closet by this teacher. And in addition to the fact that she was a little reluctant to take things the first time, as you say, and shocked that there was this generosity in her school that she had never known about, one of the most striking things that she told me was that she was shocked because if this closet existed,
Mm-hmm.
it meant that there had to be other kids in her own school whose families were suffering too.
Right.
And this was such a point of, kind of pride among these formerly middle-class families that kids did not talk with each other about the facts that their families were going through the same kind of experiences.
Okay.
There is a progression in this, and there's a long history of research on what happens to people. And the first thing is they get proud.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is they get angry. And that usually takes time. Sometimes it takes a generation. The question then is, what do they do when they get angry?
Mm-hmm.
When they get angry, they don't want to. Training and all these other supports may be good public policy, but they're very bad politics. They don't work. You can't sell it.
Right.
When you're trying to sell somebody training, you're telling them you're fired. So, there is, and when they get angry, we see what they do. That is, their demand is not for training and education, it's for jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So we elected Trump on that basis. That is, he just promised more jobs and went to Carrier and said, if they fire, I'll make them take you back. So that is the first kind of angry solution that occurs,
Mm-hmm.
is you want someone to step in and stop change. And so the rest of us have to worry about that. The fact that we're not in the Pacific trade anymore is a concern for the rest of the country, those of us who are doing well. And so the question for all of us is, what are we going to do about the people who aren't? And there'll continue to be a stream of people who aren't, unless, of course, we've moved into there's a talk now that we may have moved into a new world, full employment forever, but of course that happens in every recovery.
Right.
This could be the time when that actually happens.
It's different this time.
It's different this time.
Yeah. Well, before we kind of move on to talking about some resources that might be available for journalists out there, Amy, could you tell us what became of the people in Janesville who went through job retraining, who went to Blackhawk Technical College and did training programs? How did they fare? Did they end up getting good jobs on average?
So in addition to the survey, the other nerdy piece of work I did as part of this book was to work with a couple of labor economists on a statistical analysis of people in this part of southeastern Wisconsin who had lost jobs around the time of the Great Recession, who either did or did not go back to this technical college, which is the main place where job training was happening, to see where everybody was a few years afterwards. And the results were very sobering. It turned out that of the people who had retrained, they were less likely to be working by 2011. So this isn't up to date, but it's a good couple of years after all this job loss happened. They were less likely to have a job. If they were working, they were less likely to have some earnings all 4 quarters of the year, and they were more likely to have had a big pay drop from what they were earning before the recession to a few years afterwards.
Okay, so tell me, give me just a brief sense of, from the people, the folks who are at the GM plant or the related Lear plant, which they made seats, is that
They
right?
made seats, yes.
You know, those jobs in general were at wages of 28 or so an hour,
Yeah, it was 28 at General Motors, 23 at Lear Seating.
and then after you know a few years out and after the retraining process, I mean, give me a sense of a couple of the kind of jobs that people got that were employed. What kind of jobs did they get, and at what kind of salary levels?
Well, a couple of the women I follow in the story had gone back to school to study criminal justice.
Mm-hmm.
And they got what were about the best jobs you could get. They got jobs as jail guards at the county jail. Those jobs were paying about $16 an hour at the start, which was terrific wages for what was available. And they also, because it was a public employee job, they also came with pretty good benefits, which was not true of a lot of the other jobs that people were finding. So the unemployment rate itself is way down today in Rock County. I mean, it shot up to over 13% in 2009, a few months after all these good industrial jobs vanished. It's now around 4%. So the pattern of unemployment decline has mirrored what's happened in the country. But industrial jobs have not come back, and wages are way down.
Okay, so let's talk for, we have about 15 more minutes, and if you want to send a question in via Twitter, we will take your questions and work those into the conversation. But for journalists who are covering these issues, who are trying to cover the changes in the economy and job training and kind of whether it works and doesn't work and where the good jobs are, I was hoping Tony and Aaron, you could talk a little bit about the resources that Pew and the Georgetown Center have. Aaron, can you maybe, we talked already about the state of American jobs, but you've also studied the future of jobs, including the impact of robotics and artificial intelligence. I mean, briefly, what are the reports you did on that topic, and what's that say about what kind of jobs might be out there?
Sure. So that's actually one of the main areas that I look at is the impact that advanced algorithms and other type of artificial intelligence applications will have on not just physical or manufacturing jobs, but jobs that today are middle-class, solid, white-collar jobs that require a pretty significant amount of formal training. And so we've looked at that from a few different angles that would be potentially useful for your listeners. One of those is we do a periodic survey of experts in the tech industry, asking them about their predictions for the future. And so we've done a few questions about people's attitudes or expectations about how those developments will play out. And whether or not we can develop training programs that will train workers at scale for the potentially few jobs that will be left. If you look at our Future of the Internet series on our site, you'll find that there. The second is our report on automation in everyday life, which actually asks ordinary Americans how they're viewing this issue. And the short answer there is that they think it's realistic. They expect it won't work out very well for everybody else, but they're not really thinking of this as something that will impact them or their own jobs or professions in a meaningful way.
So they're optimistic about the technology itself, and they don't really have much of a view about whether it will, or they don't think it will hurt their job?
I wouldn't say they're not actually very optimistic about the technology itself, but they don't necessarily draw that distinction or that connection to this is something that's going to be potentially negative for society to this is going to be something that's potentially negative for me personally. When we ask people about the types of jobs that will be impacted by automation moving forward, people are thinking that this is something that will impact fast food workers and insurance clerks. If you ask them if it's going to impact their own job or their own profession, relatively few people think that that's the case. So if you sort of prompt them on it, they really don't like it. They think it's something that's going to cause job losses and increase income inequality. But it's not a top of mind concern for people in their own jobs or careers in the way that things like outsourcing or foreign imports are, for instance.
Okay, so Tony, should they be so, I guess, unconcerned about the impact on their own jobs?
They're all that is, when you think of younger people who are playing this game for the first time, they're in a game that has much more higher risk and much higher rewards. So if you're young, you're always in a gambling mood, I think.
Right.
You're always ready to trade up, whether it's a boyfriend or girlfriend or job. And I think in the end, young people don't see it this way. They do see education as their salvation. They're mostly right about that. They may make bad choices, and a lot of them do, about what they study and so on. But for older, the real tragedy here is for experienced workers. Younger workers, we know what the answer is short term. For the more experienced workers, for younger males, by the way, about 20% of high school males can still get a good job without ever getting any post-secondary education or training. That is always dwindling, but it's now at about 20%. That's not insignificant. The other piece of this is for the older workers, there is a short-term solution that we all know in our bones.
Right.
That's why everybody agrees on it, and that is infrastructure. So depending on what you believe about what's going to come out of all this, and who knows, we've done estimates on the job impacts, and what they're talking about now would at least create a couple million jobs over several years. The bigger package they were talking about before was much more robust. And that will revive the high school economy, but only for males. About 90% of the jobs that will come out of infrastructure will be for the boys. So it's a infrastructure. If I'm a politician, I'm going to vote for that bill.
Right.
Because it'll take this Janesville pressure, at least some of it's going to. Now, if you're a 45-year-old man, it's unlikely unless you can then get short-term training. You can get a certificate to be work construction equipment. You can do, this is, in fact, there'll be very large shortages of skilled trades workers in the modern sense if we do infrastructure. So the Band-Aid on this is infrastructure. That's why I think it's probably, you have to be nuts not to want to do this. Now, of course, it may blow a hole in the whole economy and all the rest of that, but it is clearly the job solution. It's the only one we got.
Okay, and just let me ask you very briefly to talk about, we talked about the Good Jobs Report. You also produced the Divided Recovery Report. Give me the quick overview of what that shows.
What that shows is that the structure of jobs in the United States is moving successively upstream. In this last recession, which was a gigantic one, we saw a huge decline in jobs that only required high school or less. That sector still has not recovered. I think as of a month ago, if you measure it one way or other, we've picked up maybe 50,000 jobs in that sector, but we still haven't recouped the lost jobs, including in manufacturing. Because manufacturing is still underwater. So where you see all the job growth is in graduate BA and sub-baccalaureate AA certificates. The AA degree is probably the most heroic performer in the so-called middle skilled job. That's the one that has really benefited greatly from growth. So it's a constant upward shift is what we're seeing.
Okay. The final thing I want to point out from your going back to the Good Jobs Report is you, in addition to talking about the nationwide numbers, you break it down by state. And so if a reporter is wanting to look at the good jobs picture in their particular state, and we put up the Wisconsin charts right there, so reporters can get this information broken down to see how many good jobs there are, what the job growth is.
Yeah, the thing that we do that, oddly enough, nobody else does for a lot of odd reasons, because economists don't care about education, education doesn't care about jobs. We ended up being the people that straddled both dimensions to this, and so we do projections. We'll have new projections out to 2026 sometime in the next several months, which will also go down to state. We'll talk about occupations, industries, jobs, and education qualifications by state as well. So we're constantly trying to figure out which degrees, certificates, badges, industry-based certifications, which ones have value. That's really kind of our thing. We try to answer the question, which ones,
Right.
which human capital treatments will help.
Okay. Well, thank you very much on that. So, Amy, in the last couple minutes that we have, I'd like to talk a little bit about the bookmaking process. You've been a reporter at the Washington Post for 30 years. You shared a Pulitzer Prize with the Post in 2002, but this was your first book. And it's a very interesting book in that you were working on it over several years. I mean, how did you, just talk a little bit about the reporting process. How much time did you spend in Janesville? And then tell me a little bit about the writing process. Were you writing back in 2009, 10, and 11, and 12, or did you report for 5 years and then write?
Well, I started this obsession with finding a community to write about out of some reporting I had been doing for the Post,
Yeah.
on which I was writing about effects of the bad economy on people, and I became very struck that something very profound seemed to be happening in this country with middle-class people who are falling out of the middle class. And I was actually terrified of the word book for a while. Excuse me, for a while I said I was working on a project because it
Yeah.
took me a while to learn to pronounce the word book without, going into pangs of anxiety over it. So I started out doing something I'd never done in my career. I received permission from the Washington Post to take a year's leave, and I thought I would be done by then. I was very wrong about that. And I started out doing a couple things at once. I started working on job retraining early on, and among the first things I did was just try to inhale the research literature on both retraining and other things that were known about what happens when people lose work. Very little of that is in the pages of the book. I mean, this is where, Tony, you and I first ran across each other. You were one of my early tutors. And I was, because I wanted to understand what was known so that when I started to see things firsthand, I would recognize that, oh, this is a commonly understood thing, or this is a little different, and why am I seeing something different? So I was doing a lot of reading. I was also starting to visit Janesville as kind of an exploratory mission to see whether it was as interesting as I thought it might be, whether people there would talk to me. And I initially got to know a few people in town who I thought would have the most interesting perspectives. So I met on my first trip out there in July of 2011, the guy who was running the local job center. I met some of the union leaders in town. I met an old-time journalist who had grown up there, to each give me their own vantage point on what had been happening the previous few years. And for a few years, every time I met somebody, I said, who else should I get to know? So I eventually got to know a lot of people in town. I did not write the manuscript for years. I did not start writing for years. But I did, after a couple of years, and this was sort of nuts that I hadn't done this earlier, but I needed to know people and know what was happening, start putting things together for a very detailed book proposal that helped me get a book contract and became kind of the roadmap for the chapters I was going to write. When I finally had a book contract, I then was very fortunate to be able to take another year almost off from my job. And that's where I really drafted the manuscript.
Okay, so you did a little bit on-the-job training yourself, training
I
yourself how to be
certainly
a
did.
book writer.
Yes.
And you can now say book. Okay.
I can say it. I
Okay.
can say book.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank all three of you. And so I want to again point our readers to the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce and the Pew Research Center, and point readers to Janesville, An American Story by Amy Goldstein. And I want to thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from Amy Goldstein, Aaron Smith, and Tony Carnevale about the future of jobs and job training in the United States. For more webinars and reporting resources, find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.